Hi, I'm Tiffin Yeaman, and my husband Joe and I have been married for 27 years. We have three daughters, Isabella, our middle is Madeline, and our youngest is Zoe. Madeline was our second daughter, and she was stillborn full term at 37 weeks. We had an uneventful pregnancy, just like our first with Isabella. At 37 weeks, I was at my office, started feeling contractions, went into labor. It was towards the end of the business day, so I called my doctor's office and just said, what should I do? And they said, since it's the end of the day, it was like 4:30 in the afternoon, they said, why don't you go ahead, you're clearly in labor, go ahead and go down to the hospital and they'll check you out. So we went down to labor and delivery. I was there for about 6 hours that night. They monitored me for a little while, then they started doing a series of tests to check the baby. And they did those tests because as they were monitoring me, they weren't picking up consistent movement from Madeline. And oftentimes they would come in and they'd say, we're getting your heartbeat, but we're not getting the baby's. We just need to readjust the monitors. So I remember a couple times saying, is everything okay? And they'd say, oh yeah, everything's fine. We're just not getting a strong heartbeat. And then one time the nurse came in and said, we're not seeing as much movement as we'd like to see, so we're gonna do a test called a biophysical profile. When we came back from the biophysical profile and they told us that she'd scored an 8 out of an 8, but I was still having contractions and they were still making comments that she wasn't moving enough, I remember my husband saying, what's going on here? Because we've got this report saying that the baby's just fine, but yet Tiffin's in labor and we keep hearing that the baby's not moving enough, and what should we be doing here? And the nurse said she was consulting with the doctor, so I only saw nurses that night. I didn't actually physically see the doctor. She just said, I'm going to consult with the doctor again and give him the results of the biophysical profile. And then a few minutes later they came in and they said, through the doctor, we've decided to calm the contractions down. They didn't really talk that much about the movement after that. And so they gave me a shot of, I believe it's called tributylane. And then they monitored me for probably about another hour or so to see if it did slow down the contractions, and the contractions did stop. And so the nurse came in and said, we're gonna discharge you and send you home. I was 10 days away from my scheduled C-section, so they discharged me. And when they discharged me, they went over the normal discharge paperwork. And one of the things I remember sticking out to them, they were saying, if your water breaks or if you start bleeding, be sure to call right away and get to the hospital right away. Now knowing what I know, I think back on those discharge instructions, and never was it mentioned if the movement changes or if the baby's movement slows down, if that feels different in any way, be sure to call your provider or be sure to come to the hospital. That was never mentioned. I do remember leaving the hospital that night. It was like midnight or 1 in the morning when we left the hospital. And I clearly remember walking through the parking lot. It was dark, street lights were on, and I remember saying to my husband, I hope everything's okay. I hope we're doing the right thing. So I came home and went to bed. And at that point, I thought rest was probably the best thing for me and for the baby. And so I woke up the next morning and was a little more concerned about, I think this baby's gonna come earlier than we thought. I better get ready for the baby. And I went on a walk with our 2.5-year-old daughter, thinking this might be the last little fun thing that we get to do together. I remember being on that walk feeling like the baby was sitting very low and very heavy, and I had a conversation with my neighbor outside after the walk saying, I'd never said the baby's not moving, but I just said this baby feels very heavy and feels very low. And what I didn't know was the baby wasn't moving and the baby had most likely passed at some point during the night. And then I had a regularly scheduled doctor's appointment later that day. And so I actually called the doctor's office and said I was at the hospital last night. They did every test under the sun and they sent me home. Should I come into my doctor's appointment today? And they said, yeah, go ahead and come on in. I told my husband, you don't need to come to this doctor's appointment. I took my 2.5-year-old daughter with me because I thought it would be just a quick in and out. And it was at that doctor's appointment when they put I think they call it a Doppler or something, but they put it on my belly to listen to the heartbeat of the baby. That's the doctor wasn't picking up a heartbeat. I didn't know that he wasn't picking up the heartbeat. I saw panic on his face, and he asked me to get up and run to the ultrasound room. And I argued with him a little bit about, oh, it's okay, everything's fine. Last night everything was fine. And as I argued with him about having to get up and run to the ultrasound room, the last thing I remember was he just kind of scooped me up. And I don't remember a lot after that. I remember him scooping me up, and somehow I got to that ultrasound room, and I think he carried me. I don't even remember the trip to the ultrasound room. And I think that's what shock is, when you go into shock and you don't know exactly what happened. And the next thing that I remember is that ultrasound machine being on just for a few seconds, and the doctor had his head down and he looked up and there were tears coming from his eyes, and he was saying, I'm so sorry, I'm so sorry. And I'm thinking to myself, everything's fine. They told me last night everything was fine. And I was the nurse was grabbing my arm, and she was starting to cry, the doctor's starting to cry, and I'm the calmest one in the room. And I said, you guys, everything's fine. And if it's not fine, let's just let's just put me in your car. Let's just go downtown to the hospital. And then he explained, I don't know what happened last night, but something has changed and there's no heartbeat now. And it probably took a couple minutes for that to sink in. I think about Count the Kicks every day. Madeline she would be 19 years old in just a couple of weeks, and a day doesn't go by that I don't think about her, and I don't think about the work that we're doing with Count the Kicks, and know that had I been told how important paying attention to movement was, and had I not had somebody explain that there's a protocol to how you do this, I definitely think that we could have caught this earlier, and she would be with us today. I reflect back when I was being discharged from the hospital and nothing was said to me about movement. I think back to how many times the nurse in 6 hours said to me, we're picking up your heartbeat and not the baby's heartbeat, or we're not seeing as many movements as we'd like out of the baby. That I hear that now, and it's just red flags go up, and I insist that somebody get to the hospital or they call their doctor. I think about that nurse, and there wasn't a protocol for them to follow. So I definitely think it's something that every maternal health care provider be consistent in their protocol, and they educate every pregnant woman about what that protocol of paying attention to movement and monitoring movement is. And it really helps give the mom just an understanding of the personality of her baby. And Count the Kicks has shown through the baby saved stories that we have that moms who are paying attention to their baby's movements, and there's some kind of indication that something's not right. We have many, many baby saved stories that show that it saved the life of that baby, and monitoring that movement was a lifesaver. We have set up Count the Kicks through a nonprofit. We're doing it because we're so passionate, and we are such firm believers in the success of this program. Whether you use our program or you just share the message and the importance of monitoring baby's movement, my message to the providers would be educate the moms, check with them at every appointment, make sure they're doing it, offer the information in a consistent manner. What I would hope for the maternal health field is to have a consistent message so that all pregnant women know about the importance of monitoring their baby's movement during the 3rd trimester of their pregnancy, and that they're all getting that information in a timely fashion, and the same information. And then when moms say, I don't know if the baby's moving, or based on what I'm tracking through this app that I'm using, or something doesn't feel right, listen to that mom's intuition and check it out. And most of the time it's nothing, hopefully it's nothing, but check it out and listen to that mom.
I'm Emily Price. I'm the Executive Director of Healthy Birthday, Inc., the nonprofit that created the Count the Kicks public health campaign. I have 2 healthy children, my son Hayden, who is 11, and my daughter Lila, who is 6, and I live with my husband Dave in Iowa. My pregnancy with my son Hayden back in 2010 was considered healthy, normal pregnancy. I tried to do everything I could to give him the best start. During my 30-week appointment, my routine checkup, I mentioned to my doctor that I noticed a change in my son's movements in the last 24 hours or so, that it was different, that he wasn't moving as often, and I noticed something had changed. During that routine appointment at 30 weeks, when I spoke up and told my doctor that I had noticed a change in his movements, she took me very seriously, and she sent me to a different office for tests where they ran a non-stress test and an ultrasound to see what was happening, to see why my baby's movements had changed. And what they discovered on the non-stress test, that at 30 weeks, I was in preterm labor. I was in active labor. He was my first pregnancy, and so I did not know that I was in preterm labor. And so after that, what they did was they said, we're gonna send you across the street to the hospital because you are in labor and we want to keep your baby inside of you as long as we can. When we arrived, one of the first things they did was give me a shot. And they said, this is a steroid for your son's lungs. So if he does arrive this weekend at 30 weeks, this is gonna give him a better chance of survival. And when they said a better chance of survival is when the first time my husband and I realized how serious it was. You know, this was almost 12 years ago. There have been a lot of great advancements in the last 12 years, but 12 years ago, it was pretty scary to think of your son arriving at 30 weeks. At the hospital, after they gave me the shot, they put me on monitoring, constant monitoring, hooked up to a non-stress test, watching his heart rate and his movements and things like that, and was then checked in for a 4-day stay at the hospital. Something else that they did, in addition to checking me regularly, was give me a pill called Procardia. And all the nurses in this room probably know what that is for. I think its original intention of that medicine was to lower blood pressure in people who have high blood pressure. I didn't have high blood pressure, but the second thing that Procardia does is help stop contractions. And so I was given that daily in the hospital, and it started to work. It started to weaken my contractions. And then after a 4-day hospital stay, they sent me home on strict bed rest, and they said, you can only get up to shower a couple of times a week, and you're gonna stay in bed this whole time. And daily pill of Procardia to help stop my contractions as best we could. And what you know, it worked. It worked. My son was born completely healthy in the 40th week of pregnancy, not a thing wrong, not a minute in the NICU. He was placed on my chest, and we laid there for a while, and it worked. They got him here safely in the 40th week. What was going through my mind through all of this, and I think my husband's mind, was just scared. We were just really scared. We didn't know what was gonna happen. We didn't know what was gonna happen, and it was just really scary. The tests, the constant monitoring, not knowing when the doctor or the nurse walked in the room again if they were gonna find something where he needed to be delivered in an emergency, or was he still there? It was extremely scary. They did everything they could to alleviate my fears, but it was still extremely scary. I think the last thing I would like to communicate today is listen to women every time they speak up. I had the knowledge that something was off with my baby, and my doctor and my nurse took me seriously, ran the proper tests, and got my baby here safely. That's what happens when we listen to your patients, when you listen to women when they have a concern, is you have the power to help improve their outcome and get them here safely. And so my message is thank you. Thank you for listening to women, and please keep doing it, because that's when babies arrive safely.